For roughly 60 years, if you asked where the Japanese people came from, scientists had a clean, confident answer. Two ancestral groups. Indigenous hunter-gatherers called the Jomon, who had lived across the archipelago for thousands of years, and later farming migrants called the Yayoi, who arrived from the continent bringing wet rice cultivation with them. Two populations meeting, blending, and eventually becoming the foundation of everyone who calls the Japanese islands home today. It was a tidy story, taught for decades, repeated in textbooks and museum placards alike. It was also, as it turns out, incomplete in ways nobody fully appreciated until genetic science caught up with the questions historians and archaeologists had already been quietly raising for years. In 2021, an ancient genome study cracked that two-part story open, revealing a third, previously unrecognized wave of ancestry that arrived centuries later and ended up contributing more to the modern population than either of the two groups everyone already knew about. That alone would be a significant enough story on its own, a well-established scientific consensus, decades old, quietly and definitively overturned. But it isn't where this story ends. In 2026, a massive new genetic study, sequencing whole genomes from more than 3,000 people across every region of Japan, found something else buried inside that already revised picture, a fourth signal, distinct from all three previously identified groups, hiding specifically in the country's northeast, connected to a historical population whose own origins have puzzled historians for generations. This is a story about how thoroughly understood a subject can seem, right up until better tools reveal there was another layer nobody had looked closely enough to find. To understand how this layered picture came together, you have to start with the Jomon, the archipelago's deepest ancestral root. Genetic evidence indicates their ancestors diverged from mainland Asian populations somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, right around the same period that rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age gradually severed the land connections that had once linked the Japanese islands to the Asian continent. Once that connection closed, the population left behind found itself genuinely isolated, cut off from the wider genetic exchange happening across the mainland for thousands of years afterward. Studies of ancient Jomon genomes suggest they maintained a remarkably small population, numbering in the range of only about 1,000 individuals sustained across many centuries, hunting, fishing, and foraging along the archipelago's rich coastlines and forests. That kind of long isolation left a distinctive genetic signature, one that geneticists can still trace clearly in people living across Japan today, though not evenly. The signal shows up strongest in the far south, particularly across the Ryukyu Island stretching toward Okinawa, where modern populations carry notably higher proportions of Jomon ancestry than anywhere else in the country, in some recent measurements, close to 29%, a striking figure for ancestry tracing back over 10,000 years. For most of the 20th century, the Jomon represented one clear, well-understood half of the accepted two-part origin story. What nobody fully grasped yet was how much more complicated the other half of that story actually was. The second recognized wave, the Yayoi, began arriving from the continental mainland roughly around 300 years before the Common-era, bringing with them one of the most transformative technologies in the archipelago's entire history, wet rice cultivation. Where Jomon communities had relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering across a landscape that offered plenty but required near-constant mobility, the Yayoi introduced a fundamentally different way of living, one built around flooded paddies, permanent settlements, and a food surplus stable enough to support denser, more organized communities. This wasn't an instant, sweeping replacement of the existing population. Genetic evidence increasingly points toward gradual blending between Jomon-descended communities and incoming Yayoi populations, unfolding differently depending on region, with some communities maintaining stronger continuity with earlier Jomon ancestry even as farming spread around them. Archaeologically, the transition is visible in the landscape itself, forested coastal terrain giving way, region by region, to expanding lowland rice paddies, a transformation that reshaped both the physical environment and the underlying genetic makeup of the people living across it. For decades, this two-stage story, Jomon foundation followed by Yayoi agricultural transformation, was treated as essentially the complete picture of Japanese ancestral origins. It fit the available evidence reasonably well. It was clean, teachable, and widely accepted by both geneticists and historians alike. It also turned out to be missing an entire chapter. That missing chapter had actually been hinted at for years before genetics caught up to confirm it. Archaeologists studying Japan's material culture had long noticed signs of what they described as a third stage of migration and cultural change, distinct from both the Jomon and Yayoi periods, associated with the era historians call the Kofun period, spanning roughly the 3rd through 7th centuries of the Common Era. This was Japan's formative state-building era, marked most visibly by the construction of enormous earthen burial mounds, some built in a distinctive keyhole shape and reaching truly monumental scale, serving as tombs for the emerging political elite of the time. For years, though, this archaeological hint about a third migratory stage remained largely disconnected from the genetic story, treated as a separate, cultural historical footnote rather than evidence of a major new ancestral influx. That changed in 2021, when researchers successfully sequenced ancient genomes recovered from individuals who lived across these different periods of Japanese prehistory, allowing them to directly compare Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun-era genetic profiles for the first time. The results were unambiguous, and genuinely surprising in their scale. A distinct third ancestral component, arriving specifically during the Kofun period, turned out to be present in the genomes of modern Japanese people, and it wasn't a minor addition. By some estimates, this Kofun-era ancestral wave accounts for as much as 70% of the genetic makeup of people living in Japan today, making it, by a considerable margin, the single largest ancestral contributor of the three, larger than the Jomon and Yayoi contributions combined. Sit with that figure for a moment, because it genuinely upends the tidy two-part story most people had absorbed for decades. The two ancestral groups everyone already knew about, the deep indigenous Jomon and the rice-farming Yayoi, together accounted for a comparatively modest share of modern Japanese ancestry once the full picture came into focus. The dominant genetic contributor turned out to be a wave of people arriving centuries later, during a period of dramatic political transformation, continental contact, and monumental construction that had always been studied as history and archaeology, but had never been properly connected to a specific, major genetic influx until this research made that link explicit. One historian not involved in the study, reflecting on the finding, noted that archaeological evidence had long pointed toward three separate migratory stages, but the third and most recent one had largely been overlooked in the broader public understanding, and it was genuinely useful to finally have confirmation arriving from an entirely different field of research. That's really the shape of good science working as intended: two independent lines of evidence, archaeological pattern recognition and genetic sequencing, arriving at the same conclusion through completely different methods, each strengthening confidence in a picture neither field could have fully confirmed working alone. Japan's origin story, once considered settled, had genuinely just gained an entire additional chapter. And that revised, three-part picture held up well for several years, becoming the new standard model researchers worked from. Regional patterns within it made intuitive sense too. The far south, the Ryukyu Island stretching toward Okinawa, retained the strongest Jomon signal, consistent with their greater geographic distance from the continental migrations that reshaped the main islands more thoroughly. Western Japan, positioned closest to the Korean peninsula and the broader Asian mainland, showed stronger genetic ties to continental East Asian populations, consistent with centuries of closer contact and exchange across that relatively short stretch of water. It was a coherent, well-supported model, and by most reasonable standards, it represented real, hard-won scientific progress over the older two-part story it had replaced. Which is exactly what made the next development, arriving in 2026, so genuinely unexpected. A massive new study, led by researchers at RIKEN Center for Integrative Medical Sciences, set out to build on this three-part framework using a scale and precision no previous study had managed: complete whole genome sequencing, rather than the more limited genetic marker technology earlier studies had relied on, applied to genetic samples from more than 3,200 people, drawn from 7 distinct regions spanning the entire length of the archipelago, from Hokkaido in the north all the way to Okinawa in the south. What that dramatically larger, more detailed dataset revealed wasn't a correction to the existing three-part model, exactly. It was an addition sitting quietly inside it, invisible to the less detailed genetic tools earlier researchers had been working with. Alongside the now familiar Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun-era signals, the RIKEN team identified evidence of a fourth, distinct ancestral component, linked most closely to populations from northeastern Asia, and concentrated overwhelmingly in one specific region of the country, the northeastern part of the main island, an area historically known as Tohoku. This wasn't scattered evenly across the whole archipelago the way you might expect a simple statistical artifact to appear. It clustered tightly in one specific place, strongly enough that the researchers felt confident treating it as a genuinely separate ancestral thread rather than noise within the existing three-part framework. And that geographic concentration pointed the research team toward a specific historical connection worth taking seriously: the Emishi, a population who lived across northern Honshu for centuries, whose relationship to the rest of Japan's early population has remained a genuinely unresolved question among historians for just as long as the genetic side of this puzzle had been considered settled. The Emishi occupy a genuinely fascinating and still contested place in Japanese history. For centuries, as the emerging imperial state expanded its control northward from the Kofun-era heartland, the Emishi maintained a distinct identity and, for long stretches, active resistance against incorporation into that expanding southern political system. Historical Japanese chronicles describe them as a separate people, culturally and, by clear implication, ancestrally distinct from the populations further south. But the Emishi's actual origins have remained a matter of real scholarly debate. Some historians have argued they represented a more direct continuation of Jomon-descended populations, less affected by the successive waves of migration reshaping the rest of the archipelago. Others have proposed closer connections to Ainu ancestry, or to distinct populations arriving separately from the northeastern Asian mainland. This new genetic signal, concentrated so specifically in the exact region historically associated with Emishi territory, offers the first genuinely direct genetic evidence connecting a documented historical population to a distinct, previously unrecognized ancestral component. A population whose own place in the broader story of Japanese ancestry had never been clearly resolved by either historical or genetic evidence until this specific study connected the two. It's worth pausing on just how remarkable it is that this discovery happened at all, in a country and a population this thoroughly, extensively studied. Japan isn't some remote, under-researched corner of the genetic map. It's one of the most intensively studied national populations on Earth, with decades of prior genetic research, extensive historical documentation, and a scientific community that has already revised its own understanding of national ancestry once, fairly recently, in 2021. And even against that backdrop of careful, repeated scrutiny, a genuinely new ancestral thread was still sitting there, undetected, simply because earlier genetic tools weren't precise enough, or the sample sizes weren't large enough, or the specific regional focus hadn't been applied with quite the same rigor, to bring it into view. That's a humbling reminder for a field that sometimes moves quickly from one confident consensus to the next. Even extremely well-studied populations can still be hiding significant, previously invisible ancestral history, waiting only for better tools and a large enough, carefully sampled dataset to finally reveal it. So here's where Japan's ancestry story actually stands today, and it's genuinely more layered than almost anyone would have guessed even 5 years ago. Not 2 ancestral groups. Not 3. At least 4 distinct threads, woven together unevenly across an archipelago that stretches from subtropical southern islands to cold northern forests, each region carrying its own specific balance of deep indigenous roots, agricultural migration, imperial-era transformation, and now, a newly identified northeastern signal tied to a historical people whose own story had been waiting, quietly unresolved, for genetics to finally catch up with it. Which part of this actually surprises you the most? That the dominant ancestral contributor to modern Japan arrived far more recently than most people assume, that a population this extensively studied still had a genuinely hidden ancestral thread waiting to be found, or that a centuries-old historical mystery about the Emishi may finally be getting its first real genetic answer. Drop your thoughts below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the ancestry stories that turned out to be far from finished.